I'm Bob Borston. I work on the public policy team in Washington. I'd like to welcome everybody here today. Today's topic is 21st century statecraft, and we're joined by Alec Ross and Jared Cohen of the State Department. They're going to chat with Eric about this topic. You may hear them moan about the poor state of technology in the federal government. As someone who worked in the federal government, I can tell them how easy they have it. When we arrived at the Clinton White House in 1993, there were still dial phones. When you called the White House operator, there was a switchboard where you had to do like that in order to be connected to people. And when I went to state in 1996, they had Wang computers. Does everybody remember? Well, actually, nobody in this audience would remember it. A few people, I see, have enough gray hair to remember the flashing green screens that were impossible to read. So take what they say with a grain of salt. These are two guys that make me feel very old and very unaccomplished. On your right is Alec Ross, who has the title of Secretary Clinton's Senior Advisor for Innovation. He is the first person to have that title, which should, again, indicate something about how they view innovation at the State Department. He helped run the technology and media and telecom policy during the Obama campaign and worked on the transition as well. And before that, he was co-founder of a terrific group called One Economy that he took from 3 people in a basement, not a garage, in a basement to being the world's largest group that focuses on the digital divide. And to his right, left, your left, his right, is Jared Cohen, who joined the Secretary's policy planning staff, which is a critical part of state where they actually make policy, in September 2006, and displayed his political survival skills by making it through the transition. If you think that your plate is full, consider his responsibilities at policy planning. They include counterterrorism, counter-radicalization, if you can say that 3 times quickly, the Persian Gulf, public diplomacy, Muslim world outreach, new technology and e-media, and youth issues. And in your spare time, I'm sure you'll tell us what you do, the rest of it. Jared is the author of 2 terrific books. One is called Children of Jihad, Young Americans Travel Among the Youth of the Middle East, and the other is 100 Days of Silence, America and the Rwanda Genocide. He got his BA from Stanford, so he should feel right at home among this crowd, and his MPhil in International Relations from Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. One other thing about these 2 guys that you should know, those Twitter aficionados in the audience should know that these 2 are having something of a race on Twitter to see who can who can gather the biggest following. At last report,
or tweet the most.
This is now out of our hands.
At last report, Alec, with 250,000 followers, was about 50,000 behind Jared. But they're not competitive about anything. So with that, Eric?
I wanted you all to meet 2 of my friends that I've worked with for a long time. I think in many ways, these 2 gentlemen represent the future of American politics at its best. Each has accomplished an enormous amount in relatively young careers, and I can only imagine what they'll be able to do over the next 10 or 20 years with the experiences that they've had so far maneuvering and navigating within our government. What I thought I would do is ask each of them sort of a simple question to get started. And I thought, Alec, I'd ask you, what does it actually mean to be in charge of innovation at the State Department? I'm actually a little confused about what you're trying to do. You know lots about telecom policy, you know lots about IT. What are you actually trying to accomplish in the State Department?
So look, the statecraft is largely unchanged from the 18th century to present day. More often than not, white guys with white shirts and red ties talking to other white guys with white shirts and red ties with flags in the background and determining the relationships between their governments. And so what we're trying to do, creating 21st century statecraft and bringing innovation in, is saying let's look beyond the traditional frame of government-to-government interaction, and let's figure out how we can create networked effects, engaging government to people, people to people, using new technologies. Let's also figure out if there are ways in which we can bring new voices into American foreign policy. So there's this thing called the Foreign Service, and it's a vaunted part of the civil service, and it's all these, more often than not, decades-long veterans of people who have gotten language training and have spent a lot of time in embassies, and they're very well trained and very good at what their jobs are. But a lot of the time, what we think that the actual solutions to some of our foreign policy challenges are oftentimes reside in the private sector, and that oftentimes things that happen in places like Silicon Valley can do more to help with upward economic mobility in Central Africa, or can get information to people around the globe about America and about democracy more effectively than the old sort of straight pants diplomats. So it's bringing some technology mojo and a new way of thinking into the State Department.
But is this basically an education problem within the State Department, like calling up all the ambassadors and say, please use Facebook, Twitter, and Google? I mean, is it literally a tactic, or is it a strategy? How does it actually play out?
So 21st century statecraft is a strategy. So the strategy at 20,000 feet is figuring out ways in which we can broaden the practice of our statecraft. And to just do it tactically, okay, we're now going to take ambassadors and get them to add a new tool into their toolbox, I think that's much further down on the supply chain within this. What this really is sort of looking at how we engage with the world differently. And part of that is deploying our diplomats differently, but part of it too is using the American people and the American private sector in an entirely different way. And so if you look, for example, at what happened in the post-Iranian election aftermath, when Jared called our friend Jack Dorsey, the chairman of Twitter, and said, look, people are using these networks to self-organize and for freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, you need to stay up. This was not a case of, traditional diplomacy. This was a case of, hey, the actual instruments of expression and assembly were riding over this social media platform. And so in this case, part of what we viewed our job as is making sure that those platforms were up and were free and open.
So Jared, when you intervened in the Twitter case, you were making what turns out to be history. Mm-hmm. In maybe a big way, maybe a small way, we will never really know. Was this the first time the State Department had been interacting with technology companies at this level? Has this happened before? Put it in context for us.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is new territory for us, and just to build on what Alex said, part of and I can provide some perspective on this having worked in both administrations. I think we get technology as a tool to connect people with information. And that's per what you mentioned, get more ambassadors using Facebook and Twitter and so forth to get the message out. But the critical shift that Alec and I are trying to drive is going beyond looking at technology as a tool to communicate and advocate our policy and message. It's absolutely a tool for those things, but it's also a tool to connect people to each other and to entities, and to connect people with actual resources, be they financial, educational, health, as in the case with telemedicines, judicial, as would be in the case of telejustice, which doesn't really exist yet. But in the context of Iran, that wasn't even the first time that we had engaged with a private sector company in, I guess you could say, a critical environment. So this goes, but I'd say the first instance was, I remember going to work on February 5th, 2008, and then Deputy Secretary of State John Negroponte had asked, he had read a piece in the Wall Street Journal about Colombians protesting against the FARC and something with regard to Facebook, and asked me if I could kind of help explain that. And so I contacted our embassy and asked, can you put me in touch with the individuals behind this massive protest that put 12 million people into the streets in 190 cities around the world? And they came back to me and said it was leaderless. So what I'm sure was the first diplomatic engagement via an online social network, I went on Facebook, found Million Voices Against FARC, and contacted them, said I'm with the State Department, I'd like to hear how you did this. And then what almost was seemed to have a lot of the characteristics of arranging like an internet date. I went down to Colombia and met with him. And people thought this was strange. Isn't this a little bit risky? And my point at the time was, it's a point that Alec and I underscore all the time. Because of technology, traditional barriers of age, gender, socioeconomic status, and circumstance are breaking down and providing non-traditional leaders an opening and an opportunity to emerge with a voice. And in this case, it was an unemployed 33-year-old engineer who had the time and also the access to technology to come up with one simple message: no más FARC, no more FARC. And in 1 month, he explained to me how he built a 550,000 person organization, and he wanted to reach millions. And so his mission was every single person that joins my group online, I'm going to give an officer role to. It started off with country leaders and municipal leaders, and then over time, anti-hacking brigades, constitutional commissions, PR teams. It was the most sophisticated 550,000 person NGO you could possibly imagine, except instead of an office, it had a URL and a website. Instead of paid staff, it had followers and members. And instead of applying for grants and relying on an annual budget, it used open source platforms. And so per your point about Iran, this is exactly what we saw in Iran. What happened in Iran in June after the elections was not leaderless. It's just you don't necessarily know the names of the non-traditional voices that were hiding behind hashtags and Facebook groups and other technological platforms, of which Google played a very important role. And so what this means is that technology is becoming an important equalizer that's leveling the playing field for who can have a voice. Now, that's a good thing and a bad thing, and we can talk about the pros and cons of it. But Iran, I think, was the first high-profile example of this.
So Alec, there's a lot more than what we've just talked about. So, for example, you all are planning more missions with technology people.
Yes.
As part of your program. You all hauled us all to this amazing dinner at the State Department with the Secretary to talk about technology and so forth. One of the things to say is that if this is the incipient connection between technology, Silicon Valley, and State Department, tell us sort of what happens, how does it evolve, right? What's the next thing you want to get done?
So the most important thing for us right now, I think, is we need to raise our corporate IQ. So, a lot of the time in Washington, whichever party's most recently won an election sort of crowns itself a community of geniuses. And there's a complete lack of humility, and what then happens is the walls go up around Washington, and there's I think a lack of engagement with the wider world. And so from the outset, part of what Jared and I have tried to do is say, you know what, let's stay grounded, let's stay humble, let's recognize that these spaces are fast moving, and let's stay connected to the community of innovators so that we can stay smart. And so there's a dual purpose in doing all of this. On the one hand, we're very focused on specific projects, specific matters of foreign policy concerns. So for example, Jared and I took a team down recently to Mexico, and because of the rampant narco trade fueled violence there, we're putting in place a program that's based on SMS, which will allow for anonymous crime reporting and creating some transparency in the crime fighting system. And so we have projects that are very specific, that are solving a very specific, you could almost call it an engineering challenge. But then more broadly, like having you over for dinner, having these delegations, Jared and I coming out to Silicon Valley, a big part of it is for us to shut up and actually show a measure of humility and listen and learn and get outside of the cocoon that is Washington. So on the one hand, it's very project focused. It's saying, let's solve big problems together. And on the other hand, it's just sort of a value of ours to stay iterative with the community of innovators.
So let's follow up and say, how much are you affected by what I would describe as the political crisis in Washington today? Mm-hmm. Is the State Department largely now separate from all of that? Because
yes.
if you read the papers, you spend some time in Washington, the future does not look good right now.
Right. So I think, I won't speak for Jared in this respect, but I personally feel relatively isolated from it. Mm-hmm. Hillary Clinton has sort of removed herself as a domestic political figure. Right. She's very focused on some very big and substantial foreign policy challenges. And that's really the world that Jared and I operate in. And to be blunt, our work is not partisan. So, Secretary Clinton gave what I hope you all agree was a good and important speech about internet freedom. And in the front row, there was Senator Brownback, a very conservative senator from Kansas. There was Senator Lieberman, there was Senator Lugar, and they all issued statements of very strong support. So a lot of what we're trying to do, if it's fighting drug-related violence in Mexico, fostering economic development in Africa, ensuring internet freedom, we don't have a big, liberal seal on us or a conservative seal on us. So I think we're doing a pretty good job of staying out of it.
So Jared, when you think about the Statecraft, and Jared has thought a lot about sort of this new technology aspects of this, and assume you were actually in charge, right, of sort of the global aspects of this. Give me a scenario of Statecraft. how would our technology, the technology all of us are involved with, fundamentally change statecraft? So my stereotype is the one that Alec described, which is basically people who are powerful and relatively clueless, negotiated in closed rooms over things that affect millions of people without their permission. That's roughly my model of statecraft, right? So what's a new way of doing that? How do you see it? And then after that, I want to start talking about the real problem of statecraft, which is war.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, and you know, that's an excellent question. And Alec and I frequently, you know, there's not a day that goes by that we don't, you know, kind of revisit the idea of, you know, how are we thinking about 21st century statecraft? And I think the best way to sum it up is statecraft in the 21st century is as much about building connections between state and non-state actors as it is doing negotiations between states. And that's a critical shift with so many challenges that we face in the 21st century and 20th century challenges, i.e. non-proliferation, taking on 21st century characteristics. We find ourselves as a government in the difficult position of not having all the tools at our disposal, not having the vigilance everywhere, not having the reach everywhere to be able to reach and play on all the different areas and challenges that we want to play on. And so per your question, I think the answer is through multi-stakeholder initiatives. So let's take your classic 20th century state challenge, non-proliferation. If we accept the fact that in the 20th century we feared the ICBM, you know, intercontinental ballistic missile being fired from a state into a United States city, and accept the fact in the 21st century our bigger concern is the suitcase bomb, we ask ourselves the question, how is a suitcase bomb likely to come into the United States? Through a human trafficking network, through a drug trafficking network, through an international organized crime network, through some kind of illicit network that may or may not have something to do with nuclear proliferation. So states alone can't actually address the challenge. Eric, you made the point when we were in Iraq that the best way to stop IEDs is to watch them being placed in the first place. And I would say the same thing with you know, thinking about the role of technology in a very state-oriented challenge like non-proliferation. You know, we're all concerned about illicit networks. I know that you know, Google's doing a variety of things on mapping and cohering and looking at putting tools in the hands of people to be able to address a lot of these issues. You know, the more that, you know, technology is a tool that allows populations in the environments where illicit networks are thriving to be more vigilant. Alec gave the great example of Mexico and counter-narcotics, giving people SMS shortcodes so they can send in anonymous tips on.
So why is that not standardized? Do you have a situation where you have 1 billion people getting phones, and everybody can use SMS, right? So there's God knows how many phones are capable right now of doing monitoring and human rights reporting,
Yes.
and yet no one is talking about this. And my impression is the governments, of course, don't want it because they don't want to be exposed, and the NGOs are not run in a way to use the technology. They're run by people who are not technologists, who are very well-meaning, but they're not fundamentally leveraging it. So is one of your projects to try to get them all to use technology to the advantage of their cause?
Yeah, so these are precisely the kinds of things that we're focused on. So we recently stood up an initiative called Civil Society 2.0, where part of what we recognized is that in order for civil society to be strong in this day and age, they actually have to master the tools of the digital age. So instead of just the 20th century framework for how we would support civil society, which is here's a grant, go have a series of trainings about, you know, democracy or some such thing. You know, part of what we're trying to do now is provide tools and resources to these organizations so that they then can become sophisticated about how to use, let's use a Google specific example, and let's go back to what Jared was describing with nuclear non-proliferation. Let's talk about North Korea. In the 20th century, an approach might have been, all right, we're going to have 10 or 15 assets, you know, intelligence agents in or around the region, and they're going to do monitoring of the transportation of illicit materials. That is limited. Think now about the millions of people who work and live along the transportation lines along which these illicit materials are being shipped. Now imagine if there were a Google map where every time, you know, somebody at the port in Rangoon said, you know, hey, I don't know what those materials are, but I'm going to report it and it's going to get mapped to a site. Suddenly, you've suddenly gone from having 10 CIA agents to you've now crowdsourced the reporting of illicit materials. And so part of what we're doing, and you know, Jared and I are brand new to this. I've only been at the State Department for 10 months, but what we're trying to do are make mistakes of commission rather than omission, and trying to figure out models where people at the edge of these networks can stand up and then sustain these efforts.
Is there an NGO that you could partner with to do your illicit material monitoring where Google provides the technology, the NGO does the work, the State Department gives them either direct or indirect support.
Well, this is where multi-stakeholder initiatives play a critical role. And I think part of the challenge is we in government don't always appreciate the significant role that technology companies can play. And I think technology companies oftentimes don't realize their relevance to say, U.S. foreign policy. And then with NGOs, you're getting NGOs that are increasingly getting into the technological space. I think the U.S. government is uniquely positioned to be the world's greatest matchmaker. We have embassies and consulates all around the world. So take Mexico, for instance. What we need to find is the right technology stakeholders that can provide the tools for anonymous reporting, tools for mapping and cohering, link them with the credible NGO on the ground that's the most sophisticated at actually looking at some of these challenges. And we're the ones that are actually able to bring them into a room because, again, we're an honest broker with no incentive other than basically connecting all the implementers and models together. And I think that's a valuable role that Statecraft can play.
So now let's go to the really dangerous stuff, which is real war. So let's imagine, I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of concern about Iran's nuclear ambitions. You all have a lot of experience dealing with the Iranian question. There's a lot of, at least anecdotal evidence, that the government does not have the full support of the people in these areas. In other words, it's a powerful government which has not necessarily got a lot of political support, and they use various mechanisms to keep in power. That issue is repeated over and over again. What can technology plus State Department do to sort of make it less likely that dictatorships evolve without the support of their people that then do really evil things to America and others?
Well, with Iran, go back to the point we were making before, which is, we don't have a diplomatic presence in Iran. So the idea of engaging and empowering, local NGOs, it's not exactly an easy task. And then even so, there's certain consequences that come with being perceived as too close to government. Now, this raises another interesting piece, which is companies like Google and others are increasingly taking on NGO-esque characteristics. That's one important piece. And then secondly, all of you sitting here in the audience, whether you realize it or not, are part of a de facto think tank in the sense that you provide and have a certain level of expertise that can actually, if put in the hands of individuals on the ground in places like Iran, can be critical at empowering them to connect to information, resources, and each other. Now, what the implications this has for Statecraft is, we need to look at a broader set of stakeholders as we think about countries like Iran than just your traditional NGOs with offices. We need to look at technology companies as key enablers. And in that sense, Statecraft is as much about, Statecraft has a domestic component where, if you all have a relevant role that you play with regard to innovating these tools, we want to engage you and one, provide that kind of situational awareness, two, play matchmaker and link you with various NGOs that are working credibly on Iran but don't know how to use the kinds of tools, for instance, to help people get around censorship, to help people map and cohere, to help people hold regimes to account, and so forth.
So this is part of why internet freedom is so important.
Right. And thank you, by the way, for such a strong statement.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, the Chinese are not so happy with me right now, Eric.
That's okay.
That they're mad at you. But this is part of why internet freedom is so important. Is if you listen to Jared and I, part of what we're talking about is networking foreign policy and crowdsourcing solutions to things that historically would have been the dominion of a white guy with a white shirt and a red tie. And the only way that will actually work, though, is if there are access to your tools and to your resources. And so the appropriate role then of the State Department is to very aggressively engage on topics like internet freedom. And I do want to talk for just a second about this because, for obvious reasons, China and Iran have sucked up most of the oxygen on this topic. But I am just about as concerned about what's happening with an additional 24 fence-sitting nations as I am about, authoritarian governments like those in Iran. The Secretary made a very important statement about when she gave her speech, where she said, this isn't just about information freedom, it's about the kind of world we want to live in. Do we want to live in a world with a single global knowledge commons from which we can all draw information and resources, or are we going to live in a more fragmented world where there's sort of gated internets country to country? And so if you think about all of those things which Jared was so compellingly describing, all of this is built on a presumption of access to these tools in the first place, which on the one hand has a digital divide component, and on the other hand has an internet freedom component.
I want to ask one more question of Jared, and then maybe get questions or comments from the audience, and then bring all of you into the conversation. We've been talking about the United States, about censorship, about crowdsourcing, and so forth. When you were in college, Jared, you spent an awful lot of time wandering around the Arab world, looking at the children of jihad. You wrote a very famous book about this. You have a lot of opinions about Africa and its development. You've been meeting with our team. We have a pretty significant effort, and one I'd like to expand. Give us a map for the next 10 years in Africa. Looks to me like it's pretty bad. So how can we make it better?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very tough question, and you know, let's talk about Congo as an example, and then I'll take
Oh,
Africa
yes. How many people? There were 2 million people killed in the last couple of years in the Congo War?
5.4 million since 1998. The largest number of people have died in conflict since World War II.
And they never get any attention from anybody.
There's no oil. There's no American economic interests. So they get...
And the crimes that are being committed on people, children, women are horrific.
But that's an important role for the technology industry to play, right? So you all are, you know, same way I say we're uniquely positioned to be the world's greatest matchmaker, you all are uniquely positioned to put tools in the hands of people to be able to expose some of what's going on. But also, I mean, Africa is this interesting place where on the one hand you have tremendous challenges. On the other hand, and Alec and I have talked a lot about the correlation between the world's biggest places with the world's biggest challenges, also having some of the world's greatest innovations. So if you look at Africa, for all the challenges that you see throughout the continent, you also have some of the greatest innovations. And in part, it's because all of you, as smart as you are, can innovate tools, can engineer things that have a huge impact, but for all of that brilliance, you can't imagine how somebody will utilize the tool that you create when it becomes a means for survival. So it's not a surprise that the most successful examples of mobile banking, for instance, in the world are in East Africa and in Afghanistan.
Let's just repeat this. You're making an assertion that basically we have this model of how everybody's using it. When the person is hungry, starving, or about to go bankrupt, or their family is about to be attacked, they're going to use our technology in a particularly clever way.
Yeah, and I think I could illustrate that with a simple question here, which is everybody here has BlackBerries and cell phones. Just by show of hands, how many of you have ever read the instructions manual? Right, and why would you? You all have basic civil liberties and freedom of speech and freedom of association. You really only need to know how to use a handful of applications on your phones that facilitate these basic freedoms and civil liberties you have. If I'm somebody living in a place like Iran or a closed society in Africa like Tunisia, that cell phone device or that BlackBerry is my only way to actually connect to tools of association and expression and free exchange of ideas. So the technology takes on a greater meaning for me. And so I'll read the instructions manual 5 times over. And I've seen kids do this. They've explained this to me. And they also frequently have more time than you all do. And so herein lies an opportunity, again, because I think it's important that there is a sense of responsibility that you all have just by virtue of being innately brilliant on everything from engineering to various other aspects of technology, which is people around the world are counting on you to innovate and innovate in creative ways to get tools in the hands of some of the world's most populations experiencing some of the greatest challenges. Don't worry about how they're going to use it. Do you think that the founders of Google and Facebook and Twitter had any idea the impact that their technologies would have on in places like Iran and Moldova? Did you think that the people that created Vodafone ever thought or imagined that last year, $1.3 billion would move in Kenya via mobile transfers? Do you think that the creators of Roshan Telecommunications in a million years thought that police and army would be paid their salaries via mobile payments in Afghanistan? No. But local populations would not have been able to innovate had tools not been actually created for them. And so it's easy to look at Africa as this huge mess and this big challenge. But I see a huge opportunity because, again, the ways in which people all throughout the continent will innovate what you create for them is probably our best hope for actually transforming the continent in ways where you'll see the populations themselves actually taking ownership over their future.
So I like to think of Alec and Jared as our representatives to the government. We elected these guys, if you will, to represent our values and the things that we care about. And I cannot think of 2 better people to work with for many years. They're here today doing seminars internally. They're here at Google for quite some time today, learning about our technology, what we're doing, and we consider them some of the best friends of Google. So thank you so much for coming.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.